Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we have 9 over 100 player online tournaments to break in the Paradox Rift format. I think there's a ton of excitement and questions around this set, so we're going to take a look at a ton of deck lists today and start pinpointing what are the reasons why these are the lists that are doing the best in the format right now. We're also going to have a look at the popularity of archetypes. We had the late nights yesterday, so we should be able to track down what's popular as well, which is going to be really important as we head into the LAIC to start figuring out what percentages are going to be played in that tournament to help carve out what are going to be the better plays as well as the best lists in general. We're going to start with the Kitchen Showdown, and we have a Lugia Finals actually, which is pretty interesting. The first list is going to be incorporating the Earthen Vessel, which allows us to increase our discard synergy cards in general, where you can get even more ways of pitching Archeops in the opening stages. But the kicker is you get to play Basic Energy to help accommodate the Radiant Charizard and the Iron Hands EX. I think these are the two guaranteed Basic Energy that you should be playing in the deck list. There's also some reason to play Water Energy in the deck as well, especially if you respect Snorlax Stall, which we'll talk about a couple times today because it is going to be popular. But it's a very similar shell that we've seen with previous Lugias. Surprisingly, it's playing just 2 Stadium and 1 Pump. Maybe that's a sign of things to come in terms of what decks are actually playing Path in this format. Arceus seems to be really dropping off. Roaring Moon seems to be a tough matchup. It would be really, Maridon and then that question mark of Giratina, where there seems to be a ton of play in the Japanese tournaments right now. But in the West, it seems like there's a lot more resistance to play Tina. There's still a good amount of results for the archetype, though. So maybe you can get away with this count. Seeing Mesagoza cut from the list, especially for third Nest Ball and stuff like that, is a surprise. I'd personally prefer to see some higher ratios and also some pretty low support accounts with just the 2 research, the 2 Iono. I personally think with Iron Hands helping accelerate your game, you can probably get away with just 2 Snorlax, maybe even 1 Snorlax, honestly. So there might be a couple things to wiggle around here. Also the 3/3 Lugia. When you're not playing Great Balls, I think this is a little bit risky as well. So a couple things to touch on here. But overall, it seems like the Vessel gives you access to some of the best attackers in the game right now, and that really is a nice driving force for Lugia. The second place list was more of what we've seen previously, where it's mostly just Colorless Energy with 1 Luminous, 1 Charizard. The Vessel does take up a few spaces, so I can understand there being some resistance to it. Also, just throwing in the Dunsparce makes the Iron Hands far less threatening. Of course, you still have Lumineon that they can gust up, which is a problem for you, to take a 3-prize KO on this guy, but you're at least forcing more things from the opponent here and there. And of course, they can gust up the Dunsparce and still take a 2-prize knockout on it. So it's not like a fix, really, but it's something Lugia can do if they want to safeguard themselves, not only against Iron Hands, but also against just Maridon in general, is fairly reasonable. I still think that Iron Hands is a big enough payoff card to always put it into your Lugias, but there has been a decent number of even Japanese results that I've been keeping a close eye on that are staying true to a no Iron Hands list. And it does let you play some additional copies of cards. In this case, we see 4 Burnett, obviously, but sometimes you just see 1 Burnett and then you have the extra space for the researchers. You get to play, in this case, a Serena, which is an extra discard synergy card over the 4th copy of Boss's Orders, which is contentious, but you can just see the general counts of supporters are higher in this deck list compared to the previous one that we've just seen, because you have a little bit more space. You're not having to squeeze in Vessels. Think of it like Single Strike Lugia, where they had to play the Urns. Those Vessels are taking a very similar space, really, in Lugia, so playing a more straightforward colourless build does open up a few lines to play either more ball search cards or more supporters or whatever you like. We do have a fusion-based Mew in the top 4. Mew had a really good week, actually. I think 4 of them ended up winning tournaments, so we've got a lot of Mew to look at today. This fusion list plays 0 new cards, actually, so it's just tried and trusted. This is what we know, and it's incorporating the catchers to try and cash in on the multi-prizes. It does feel like there's going to be a lot of basic EX and V multi-prize matchups running around right now, and that does bode well for an aggressive archetype like this. I would say that you're kind of unfavored into Roaring Moon generally, because I feel like you're less consistent at getting a turn 1 Echo for full value compared to them getting a turn 1 attack into you. And the fact that you have a 1-prize Pokemon doesn't actually offset their race too much, because Roaring Moon specifically is really good at dealing with Mew, thanks to weakness, and they can also be a 300 hit point Pokemon with their ancient boosters, so yeah, it's rough out there for Mew, but surprisingly it managed to do pretty well And I think the Catchers does give you that momentum where you choose to go second into the moons, you try and go all in for the Echo play. If you hit heads and take out the first moon they attach to and whatnot, maybe you make life difficult for them. But I do think this is going to be a tough ask in the game. That being said, there's more decks in the format than Roaring Moon. There's still a lot of diversity. And it seems like more people are happy to tech like Spiritombs into Decklist, where this has the answer. And I really don't think many things are playing Drapion. Drapion is definitely a decent card that used to be in Lost Box. Lost Box is kind of dropping off right now. So really it's going to be down to those responsible adults who continue to want to tech for Mew or don't, because as we know, it has the potential to spike any tournament if it's not being kept in check. I feel like I'm always someone who lands on that side of respect towards the deck, but it feels like many people just want others to do their dirty work for them, and when that doesn't happen, especially in the first week of tournaments when people are trying out new stuff, aren't necessarily concerned about Mew, that's when it can thrive in the online space. We have our first, and certainly not the last, Roaring Moon that we're going to talk about today. Kind of a turbo-y approach. It has some Pokestops in here, but still is incorporating one copy of Town Store and the Forest Stone Moltres V E-Switch package. There are a few different distinctions around this archetype. I would say that a full-on quad Pokestop with no Moltres is kind of what I would call the turbo build. I'm saying that Moltres E-Switch is like its own build in its own right, but this seems to be like a hybrid anyway, where it's still incorporating one Town Store, has the cross switches as well, so really is in between what I would call a turbo list and a more E-Switch based build. I'm slightly surprised to just see 3 copies of Roaring Moon EX, especially when you are slamming Pokestop. It can feel like a small punish for you and a small window of opportunity for things to go wrong. But outside of that, I really like what's going on here. The Professor Churro scenario is an interesting one. Actually pretty big against control, which is something we actually have to consider these days. And every now and then it could be a great way to take Pokemon off your board as well. When you come up against some Iron Hands based builds and you force a single prizer into the active position, they take a 1 prize knockout, then suddenly the likes of Luminion and Squawkabilly can give up a 3 prize card swing later on in the game. So if you can churro that up and remove that from play, it can actually be a really big deal. It's actually why I've enjoyed seeing Collapse Stadium as a secondary in the Roaring Moon builds personally. I feel like not spending on support on it is quite valid. But you have the upside of being good against controlling decks, because this deck does lack a few switch counts overall. This one's just playing Crossies, 2 Carts, and a Churro. So if you're really concerned about block lacks, you could also consider having like a Power Pad in here as well. Because I think we're at that stage where block is probably within those top 10 decks in terms of performance right now, that we really do have to respect the archetype. So it may look like a strange inclusion, but actually if we care about block lacks going into the next set of tournaments, it's a pretty reasonable choice. Surprisingly, we have a quad Entei list. Again, no new cards from this set. Just trying to say that in this metagame, being fast with Entei, having Radzard and Thornton as a late game potential line seems quite solid. It's amazing that this doesn't play any new things, but it's just trying to capitalize on the new meta, I suppose. You're trying to use the Flare symbol Moltres to increase your damage output, basically turning your Entei into like a Palkia, especially with Bravery Charm as well. You're pushing that hit points threshold, forcing like Roaring Moon to damage itself and such. So really interesting. I feel like Entei Valiant has kind of sprung up since this list has come out, but really amazing that an archetype like this could have just been waiting in the wings for a 2 prize versus 2 prize format, and it seemed to have done well this time around. Does seem a little bit too narrow to be a real deck in the game, in my opinion. We have a really interesting Gardevoir list that is incorporating 2 copies of Town Store and 3 copies of TM Evolution. I think those ratios are a little bit strange. I think I would sooner go higher on the stadium bounces than having higher counts of the physical tool itself, and I'm a little bit surprised that this isn't just like at least 1 copy of Arven in the deck list, so you have some going second potential as well. Obviously you can only use this card going second, so I imagine that would be the choice for this deck list. I've really been enjoying and toying around with a lot of TM Evo Guardi, both with Arven but also with this traditional support account and Town Store as well. I think it's actually a super interesting space, and I do feel like the TM Evo gives you the best defense against Iron Hands. I'm going to keep banging that drum because I think it's just the truth. If you're not playing the Evo package as Guardi, you can get farmed by Iron Hands if it comes on the board turn 2 against you. Some people tell me that's a high roll. I think I don't want to lose to a high roll as Guardi because there are decks that will do it against you. So it's really whether or not you believe in an Arven-based approach or a build like this, which is just going to go heavier on like Town Store as your stadium bouncer's choice, have more traditional supporter cards, knowing that you can try and TM evolve in a ton of situations. Playing the double counter catcher as well as the boss's orders is super interesting. That's a lot of space being committed to Gust, but ultimately it keeps you on that really solid prize map, which I do really value. And let's not forget, it's also got the very spicy emergency jelly, which can help out against lost spots, but also Iron Valiant variants around as well. If they're trying to set up damage here and everywhere, you can try and undo that with the combination of Crest, Jelly, and Collapse. That should give you a lot of coverage. One thing I will say though, once again, have to be a little bit concerned about Snorlax, so I'm personally starting to lean towards Palpad Churro as a small package, especially if you're just playing one Collapse Stadium. I feel like that's a decent card anyway, and it's a surprise to me that this list is choosing to play Town Stores and not incorporating Forest. I feel like it would just be a natural include, so I like to see Evo, and I do think it's really strong in Gardevoir. There are plenty of lists that are being successful with just a pure Candy approach, but I feel like against an Iron Hands user, they really do make you have the absolute nuts, and Guardy really does need to respond immediately to that card, otherwise it's going to go downhill. We have another Roaring Moon doing pretty well. This is what I would consider like the turbo build, very high on those basic energy. The quad Pokestop has Poké Gear in addition to Luminion in the deck list, trying to keep very low to the ground. The Mew VMAX is a really nice pivot. I do think Morpeko is definitely worth it in the deck list for what it's worth, and I think we'll see that going forwards. But yeah, just good to see that a very straightforward streamlined list can also do pretty well. It's just trying to do the thing, and for an early meta, that's really what Roaring Moon's trying to do, set its stall out. And this list seems to do it very effectively. And then we end this first top 8 with like a Brent Tonneson style supporter lineup where we have the double boss, the double worker, the quad Iono. It has squeezed in the counter catcher. Mew VMAX is still in the deck list. I feel like it's a really solid card still. But I genuinely have real concerns that especially with only 2 candy, you have to find both of them if you want to respond on a hands. That's just not going to happen. So it does terrify me a little bit. Or you're playing Guardy and you're choosing to sack Iron Hands matchups and Valiant matchups if they both pop off into you, and I feel like that's a risky space to be in as Guardy. So we haven't started to see full development of the archetype, but I do think that's a concern for Guardy going into this meta if you're not willing to adapt to TM Evo builds. We move on to the Tournament of Doom, and we start off with a Fusion Mew. Like I said, it won a number of these tournaments. Once again, it's that kind of speedy catcher-based list, trying to just have really aggressive starts and push on from there. It's still one of the best decks that draws a ton of cards, and as long as people don't put in techs from you, it's a really good deck. We have a Giratina VSTAR coming in that second place, also a deck that benefits massively from Counter Catcher. Seems like a really straightforward streamlined list, to be honest with you. Counter Catcher fits like a glove in this deck because you are going to sit there selecting and passing or abyss seeking in a number of situations as well. I do think the counter catcher gives this deck a new dimension. It means on the second turn of the game you can be gusting even though you're playing a Colrus if you're up against aggressive archetypes that obviously take a prize against you. But it also means as you whittle down to that late game, you can try and go for counter catcher, Lost Mine, Roxanne, Iono style plays where you put your opponent down to that low hand size, bring something up, try and buy a turn, cross your fingers. You can weave that in with the path as well. And that's a huge combo, of course. But if it all comes together, you can put yourself right back into the mix and catch up from prize deficits, which is honestly where Tina likes to feel most comfortable. So pretty cool to see that overall. We have a really interesting Roaring Moon in top 4, which seems to capture the imagination of many players, where we're seeing 2 copies of Water Energy. The idea being that you can use vessels to tutor these out pretty quickly. You then solder 2 water onto your Roaring Moon, and you'll see there's 4 copies of Energy Switch. You pop those over to your Greninja, and suddenly you have a Moonlight Shuriken option powered up in 1 turn. If nothing else, this shows that Energy Switch is really good for the consistency of getting a turn 1 attack off, and it also demonstrates that having some single prize attackers like the Morpeko and the Reddit Greninja are really solid in the game right now. I've come up against a list like this, and even though it doesn't come off all the time, it makes your opponent play differently. It forces Manaphy down onto their board, makes them commit Ball Search, makes them take up a bench space where it would otherwise be like a backup attacker or a consistency Pokemon. So I do think this has value and genuine legs. And I love to see a build as turbo as this, where we just have a ridiculous amount of item cards. We have the quad Trekkies, which I think is really strong in Roaring Moon as well. And it's really not wasting any space in the list and just leaning into those vessels to make it all happen. We then have a Radiant Charizard Lost Box, similar to Terrence Miller's regional list from a few weeks back now, but with a few additions from the new set. It's incorporated 1 copy of Counter Catcher. Like I was saying with the Giratina, you can make some heroic plays with Sableye come together, and because this deck's late game is so often trying to use Clara, I really like having that as the Gus choice within the deck list. And then we also have the Technical Machine Devolution. I think this really does help out against the the Charizard EX matchup and can help out against the Gardevoir matchup, of course, as well. Even the Chien-Pao matchup, you can do all sorts of things here where you are going to go for that Devo play. And I think specifically Charizard EX was a bit of a rough matchup for this archetype, so I do like to see it as a tech inclusion. I feel like this build kind of has that license, that space to put it in, because you're not playing like heavy energy and gates and such. My one kind of main concern with this deck list is having an instant response to Iron Hands. I think this is going to be addressed with other Radiant Charizard lost boxes that we'll look at later on, but I do think you need to have the likes of Raihan, Double Turbo Energy, Mirage Gate, a combination or all of those in your deck list so that you can burst a Charizard onto the field more early in the game, so you can insta-respond on Iron Hands, so that you're essentially trading evenly with the card. With a build like this, I don't think you really have that, unless your opponent's putting Iron Hands into play in the latter stages where you're naturally opening up your Charizard anyway, which makes me a little bit nervous. We have our first Iron Valiant EX variant making it into the top 8. Really interesting approach where we have the Medicham plus Basculin Rapid package, where we have Yoga Loop available to us, and we have the Swarm the Wound option from the Basculin, dealing 30 plus 10 more for each counter on your opponent's active Pokemon, making use of Rapid Strike Energy so that you can make those turn 1 Yoga Loop plays available. But then, instead of seeing the Urshifu, we actually have a 2-2 line of Jolteon VMAX instead. Let's not forget that Jolteon V is a natural free retreat pivot, as is the VMAX, which obviously makes this a really great lead in the deck, because it's getting you straight into your Tachyon bits without having to spend switch cards. We have the early Thunder Spear option, which can actually work similarly to Medicham, actually, where you have another way of dealing 20 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Doesn't sound like much, and obviously you're not taking an extra turn, but sometimes you're just not quite getting over the line, and it gives you even more outs to make sure you're finishing off that early Frigibax, that early Ralts, that early Charmander, those sorts of Pokemon. It can still be an option for you. And the Jolteon VMAX, similar to Urshifu, is able to capitalize on Pokemon that have damage counters on the bench, and suddenly we're dealing 100 to the active and 100 to the bench Pokemon. It's not quite as versatile as Gmax Rapid Flow, because both of those snipes can go anywhere, but there are some major upsides to the Jolteon. Firstly, I think your time into Lugia is obviously much stronger, because now you're hitting for much better damage output. And secondly, your weakness is much more palatable. Otherwise, you'd be pretty awkward against Gardevoir. They essentially need to make one EX Pokemon, and suddenly they're churning through your Urshifu, whereas the Jolteon will tank a little bit more, possibly force the opponent to get other Pokemon into play, and heavily damaged, which then sets you back up with Valiant and Medicham once again. And of course, we can use Max Thunder Rumble turn by turn by turn, whereas unless you're playing a Melanie build of Urshifu, you come in with a Rapid Flow, and it's very difficult for you to do it again. You'd be ending up using a Gale Thrust on the following turn in the best case scenario, which again forces more like switch cards and stuff from the hand, whereas this Jolteon can spam the Thunder Rumble and can easily retreat in and out of Valiant as and when it needs to. So I do think this list actually has a ton of validity to it. I need to test it out a little bit more, because I've mostly played with the Urshifu and Entei builds, but this seems to have a lot of great logic behind it and feels like a really strong list as well, especially if you're expecting Lugia to be a presence in the metagame, as well as Gardevoir. Also in top 8, we saw a Roaring Moon build that was incorporating a Barrel line. Now this is actually really popular in Japan, and has got a ton of results behind it. Hasn't really converted as much in the Western world. I think we're just loving the turbo me go fast, me hit turn 1, me never lose type strategy. But I do think there's a lot of validity to having Barrel in the deck list. Obviously, this is a turbo deck. Obviously, we're putting a lot of 2 prizes into play every single game. So all it takes is one whiff for Roaring Moon to go from a really powerful position to a losing one. So having a Barrel fallback means that you can have a little bit of draw into the latter stages. And against these decks like Charizard and Gardevoir, they're going to spam Iono to get back into the game. Barrel's going to help you out. The rest of the top 8 is another one of these E-Switch Water Energy Roaring Moons, as well as a pretty straightforward Giratina. We move on to Hoarder's Pokemon number 2, and yep, it's the big boy. It's Snorlax still getting its first win, with the very obvious buff of Counter Catcher coming into the deck list. We obviously don't take prizes, we have no energy in the list, so we are always going to be going behind in prize cards unless our opponents are finding ways to knock out their own Pokemon, which means we can play a plethora of supporter cards for consistency, draw power, and alternate disruption to spamming bosses' orders. You'll notice we do have energy disruption from the likes of Giacomo and Sydney. We have Penny for picking up and putting down our Pokemon when we are able to tank with our Bravery Charmed big boys. We have the Misfortune Sisters hoping to cherry pick switch cards out of our opponent's top decks to remove their outs to block. We still do play Boss's Orders to pick things up, obviously if they're choosing to not take prizes or make sure that they're level on prize cards with you. But we also have the Echoing Horn, the Erica's Invitation, even Avery to clear the opponent's board before using Echoing Horn can be a play to force things down onto the board, for you then to stall with block. I think the coolest thing about this deck list is that choosing to play the Spiritomb. It's actually a mirror tech card for the most part, where you are trying to block your opponent's use of Pidgeot when you come down to the nitty gritty in the late game. We'll have a look at matchup data later, but honestly, Blocklax looks like a real threat in the format, just because it has so many ways of forcing Pokemon onto the board, which really aren't able to deal with a continuous block combination. It was able to beat a pretty straightforward colorless Lugia in the final. Some pretty cool stuff with this one. It's playing the Quad Great Ball. I've been listening to a lot of Trevor Reed talk about this on the Drew Too Many podcast, one of my favorite things to listen to. He's basically my authority on Lugia because he's done so well with it for such a long period of time. And if he's a believer in Great Ball, then so am I. We have a couple Charizard EX in the top 4. This list is choosing to continue with the very high rare candy counts. The new inclusions include Jirachi to help out against Medicham, as well as Sableye, as well as the Professor Churro, which is certainly an upgrade to Penny that was previously in the deck list. It means you can pick up damaged Zards as well as Pidgeot. And once again, I'm going to tip my cap to the control players who are going to try and trap stuff over and over again. So Churro adding to your counts is pretty handy. I'm surprised to see the choice bet in the deck list. I think a lot of people have been moving on to Vitality Band or Defiance Band. It feels like that's a big tool card with so many more EXs in the metagame now, especially the likes of Roaring Moon and Chien-Pao, that I personally would like to see that shift to a different tool. And there's a lot of debate going on whether or not Lost City is still the most valid choice. I've been exploring League Headquarters. I think it helps out your Roaring Moon matchup while still being okay into Sableye and Maridon. And just in general, Lost City was mostly a tech card for the Lost Zone players, so if you're already playing Jirachi, you may be able to open up your stadiums to be more useful, like Town Store or Artisan. So here's the other top 4 lists. Like I said, these are the tools that are becoming more and more prevalent and popular, and I do back certainly the Defiance Band as one of the strongest choices. And again, it's choosing to play different stadium cards, as I just mentioned. Choosing to play Collapse as well. I do think this is another valid option for taking Pokemon off your board if you don't want to play the Churro or Penny. And the new big inclusion of Countercatcher as well works a dream in this list, because of course you have Arven and Pidgeot that can cherry pick this at the right time. It's obviously very important when Charizard's damage output isn't all that powerful straight out the gate, so making sure you can pick up opposing Squawkabilly and Fish to keep up in a race can be really handy. We have a Maridon incorporating the Iron Hands. There's the small nod to Iron Hands in this deck list with the double turbo energy coming in as well, of course helping out with this card, but can end up going on to Raikou if it really needs to as well. And in the very worst case scenario, it can be another way to retreat your Flaffy. It's sticking with Path to the Peak, which I definitely think is the right thing to do, and still having the Judge plus Iono in fairly high counts. This definitely continues to be a real win condition against so much of the format, and might make Maridon a really good going first archetype when you're facing down Roaring Moon, because jamming a Path early can just put your opponent onto that cold sweat moment of whether or not they have a stadium in their opening 7 cards. I also think Lost Vacuum's great right now, really helps out against the Roaring Moon matchup, pretty good for the mirror match if that's going to stick around, and gives you an Arven bounce to Path if you're up against the likes of Tina, or the mirror match as well. We have another really interesting Radiant Charizard list that did pretty well. This was incorporating the Quad Mirage Gate. It's kind of clunky to play gates in a list that doesn't play Radiant Greninja, but I do think this list treads the line quite nicely because it's playing the Pokestops. The idea being that whenever you're bidding these Darkness Energy, that's actually really helpful for you because it's helping you set up your Moltres for Clara plays down the line. I'm very surprised to just see 1 copy of Sableye. I would have expected that to be in higher counts. But with a combination of Charizard and Moltres, you do have plenty of late game beat sticks. Radiant Charizard in general is one of my favourite cards in the game right now. It seems so powerful into Roaring Moon, into Chien-Pao, into Maridon, that it seems to be just a massive card. And obviously the Moltres gives you great type coverage into the Gardevoir and Mew players. Although it looks strange on the surface, I think it's a very well built 60, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this build of Charizard also do pretty well, especially when we have the Gates combination to bounce back onto Iron Hands. There was a Goldengo in top 8. It's incorporating a mini Arven package where we have 2 copies and 1 TM Evo, so it's more of an option than a go-to style play in every game. We've got the triple Worker and triple Pokestop to give us plenty of means of bouncing Path of the Peak, so we can continue to use our coin bonus and concealed cards throughout the game. With the Pokestop count, it really makes the energy retrieval in addition to Superior a really solid choice here. I'm surprised there's not even 1 copy of Letter of Encouragement. I still feel like that's such a big burst of energy to find in the opening stages in particular, to make sure you're able to get over Roaring Moon with 290 hit points or a Charizard EX bearing down on you in the opening stages. But in general, this is looking like a pretty solid list. When you're not going all out on TM Evolution, the barrel makes a lot less sense. I think a 1-1 Sizzle package is perfectly fine to help out against the Chien-Pao matchup. and just in general giving yourself a one prize attacker to try and offset that prize race. And it's interesting to see a number of switch cards in the deck list to see additional random cards over just having additional copies of Vessel, Letter, like I said before, even just the extra Ultra Ball, because random cards can always be improved on, I think. We then have a slightly different build of the Greninja combo package because it's incorporating the Darkrai VSTAR so that you can Star Abyss some item cards back. I think the idea being you can get back some of those Energy Switch possibly, which I think is kind of cool. Darkrai has been fairly popular in Japan. Typically though, in a build like that, you would definitely consider Cross Switcher to be a no-brainer because then Star Abyss becomes a boss when you need it to be. So it feels a little counterintuitive to have it in a list that's playing the heavy boss count. However, it's cool to see the cameo of Darkrai. It can be a decent card into one prize matchups as well because it just has a natural high base amount of hit points. And in this case, we're seeing no copies of the Ancient Booster Capsule. I think it makes you slightly unfavored in the mirror match, but I don't think it's unsurmountable. And I think it's pretty reasonable to maintain a high item count because you are leaning into those Pokestops. Next onto Card Cavern, we have another Fusion Mew doing pretty well. This one isn't playing the Pokemon catchers, so it's not all about the cheese. This one's much more similar to how we've seen the build in the past. Again, it's one of those situations where we're in that first week of tournaments, people aren't respecting Mew enough. I feel like there will be that tipping point where people once again start putting the tech cards back into Mew, because it feels like just Roaring Moon and Charizard alone are not enough to deal with this archetype. It feels like other lists are going to have to fall in line and start respecting Mew again, because if not, it's going to continue winning these tournaments. We have a POW hand extension list here, where we're incorporating, obviously, the Iron Hands EX plus 1 Lightning Energy and the double Earthen Vessel into the deck list. Low-key, I was initially on the 1 Vessel 2 Lightning, but I think it's much better to play it this way round because it gives you extra burst damage into the Mew and Charizard matchups. And I think really you just take it on the chin if you are prizing one of your pieces. The other interesting thing to note is that it's taken out the cross switchers and has just slotted in 1 counter catcher as the only Gust option. This deck is setup based. I feel like you are quite capable of going second with the list, just to improve your outs of getting a board state going on that first turn of the game where you want to have multiple Frigi and Bidoof developed. So naturally you can give up a prize card, then suddenly bounce back with Irida counter catcher if you need to use Iron Hands, or Chien-Pao to make sure you're taking multi-prize knockouts. Overall, this is a really consistent list, and I think a great baseline for anyone looking to play this archetype. We have even more variation with the Roaring Moon here. I think it's been so popular that it's inevitable that we're going to see slight tweaks here and there. Just a small note really is that Vit Band can be an alternate option to playing the Brute Bonnet if you don't enjoy it being a single prize attacking option. I think, again, more so, it's better if you play multiple Town Store to make this more consistent, but it's another way of hitting that 230 threshold. We have another Snorlax. They're all more or less the same with a very similar outcome. We have a pretty interesting Gardevoir list, which is incorporating the Counter Catcher as the new card, as well as seeing Artisan in a 2-count, which you don't often see in Gardy, but it's incorporating an Avery plus Screamtail into the deck list. The more I see Screamtail and Gardy, the more I feel like I underestimated this card initially. The main play I kind of missed with this card is that you can go for snipe prizes whilst using Iono and Counter Catcher on the same turn. I feel like that's actually something that I really missed with the card, and it's actually a really huge play. One thing I will note is that I would still choose to play Cresselia in my deck list. The card seems still way too good to pass up on. An Avery over Worker is an interesting one. Trying to hurt some of these setup decks potentially here and there. There are many archetypes that are trying to develop double Barrel, so this can be quite good against Chien-Pao, can be quite good against Charizard, and the mirror match as well at times. And again, this can be another way you can pick apart your opponent's board. You can go for an Avery, force down a low bench, especially if they have like multiple engine Pokemon developed, and then you can use Screamtail to take out the other option. So this little guy is actually opening up a lot of interesting lines, and ultimately it doesn't surprise me that it's seeing a ton of play right now. Even more variety going on with Radiant Charizard. This one is starting to incorporate the right hand. It's actually playing quad Pokegear, which is pretty intense. It's also playing that Counter Catcher for Gust in addition to the boss's orders, and it does have that TM Evo for a number of matchups as well. For me, I'd still like to change up these ratios a little bit, probably put in second right hand, maybe even consider that double turbo coming into the deck list. But, you know, you can't really argue with having really high odds to Colress because that's what the deck's all about. We have a pretty straightforward Giratina doing well, and then we have a Rapid Strike Inteleon deck list, another pretty interesting one. Feels like there is a question mark between this and the Rapid Valiant deck list, but in this case, we see Intel still working it out. It's incorporated a Leafy Camo Poncho. It's a one-of. I don't really know how often this actually comes up, but I suppose you're trying to make the prize map more awkward for certain players. But of course, there's still a lot of cross-switcher in the format, especially with Roaring Moon, and that's one of your more awkward matchups, so I feel like it's probably bait. But just a nod to Urshi Intel in general, I don't think this archetype necessarily just dies because there's the potential to Valiant. The Redacted Paradox #1 was won by a Charizard list. Playing the very cheeky 101 line of Pidgeot seems like far too of an important card to play a 101 line of, but it seems to have done well here. And I suppose you have to make the spaces somewhere for the new inclusions of Jirachi. And this list is choosing to play a really high count of the triple Lost City in the deck list as well. Again, this is a bit of a surprise to me. I feel like the card is a little bit less powerful right now, with Lost Box being in a precarious spot. But that being said, there's enough Radiant Charizard that possibly it's still worth the space. I think it's pretty likely that Arvanzards will be changing up their stadium count. Possibly Lost City just becomes a one-off from now on, because I do feel you could be getting value from other things instead now. We do have a Rapid Strike Iron Valiant list that got second place. Seems like a really nice baseline, pretty turbo. I do like the Thornton in the deck list. I feel that's very solid. It's playing a TM Devo as well. There are situations where your opponent still can piece something together, so having a Devo turn is also a pretty solid option. My main concern with this card is just timing, really. When you can try and find this. If you see it in the opening stages, it immediately discards itself at the end of turn, so you can't always get value. So I'm a little cynical of the inclusion, even though I get the logic. We have a pretty straightforward Pidgeot build and Iron Hands build of Chen Pao. We then have friend of the channel MP's Radiant Charizard list. This is the one that I think has stood out to me as the best build that I've seen so far, where I think it's really respecting the Iron Hands with the double copy of Raihan, the Gate, and the double turbo in the list, as well as 2 Poker Gear. I feel like you're basically always getting that instant response when need be. It's also playing the 2 copies of TM Devolution, which I think is pretty interesting. I feel like you get away with 1 copy more often than not. But don't forget, it does add to your Lost Vacuum count to actually help you push towards your Sableye, which I think is also pretty interesting. Once again, Countercatcher feels like a real no-brainer in this list. You love playing from behind, you can set up damage all over the place, and Charizard comes on strong in the late game where you really mop up your prizes. And then we have a couple straightforward Fusion Mews and a Quad Great Ball Iron Hands Lugia for this one. A Bibarrel TM Evolution Charizard was able to win the Pumpka Weekly. This has been really popular in Japan, and it hasn't really kicked on too much. Seems like many people are still happy to play the Quad Candy Pidgeots out in the West so far. But this has been a combination I've been trying out myself. The logic being that this deck wants to go second anyway, giving yourself that Arven TM Evolution combination, even the Town Store in the deck list to give yourself really good odds of this. Just really helps you set out your stall early with a Bibarrel plus Charmeleon, meaning that on that turn 2, you've already got draw power developed and you need so little to actually get a Charizard going. Even if you are hand disrupted, you have that fallback option. Some interesting stuff in this deck list. Playing the quad 70 hit point Charmander may just be out of fear of Valiant, but I do think there's a reason to mix up your Charmander line. I actually think 2 Blazing, 1 Promo, 160 hit points is my personal optimal choice. So just a tiny note there. Also, it's choosing to play 2 copies of Level Ball, but still sticking with 3 copies of 100 hit point Charmeleon. I feel like if you are going to go down this avenue, you should at least play 190 hit point Charmeleon just to give yourself extra access to that card in the mid game. But overall, really cool to see this list in action, and I do think it has a ton of legs in this format as an alternative to the Pidgeot approach. We have a pretty normal Gardevoir that was playing League HQ as one of its stadiums in second place, and then we had a pretty straightforward Giratina in the top 4. We have a pretty cheeky Maridon list, which is playing double hands, 2 double turbo energies, and the quad trekking shoes in the deck list. This one really is throwing caution to the wind, scrapping the Path of the Peak to have the 2 copies of Beach Court and the Town Store, really saying that Ampy very much is the win condition against the Lost Box players and against the Guardy players. And I can't question it too much, to be honest. The trekking shoes helps filter out to make sure you're finding those generators, and the Beach Court means you're not having to attach retreat out of things, and just adds to your turn 1 donk potential if you are going second. We then have another Rapid Valiant doing well. Some interesting stuff in this deck list, playing a couple copies of the Arven supporter, giving you access to Forest Seal Stone and Future Booster Energy Capsule. These are obviously very important cards in the deck list, and preferring to play Pokestops over that heavy Town Store count, which is something that I was leaning towards. Pokestop having obvious upside potential because you play so many item cards in the deck list. And it's also incorporating the Grant supporter. I actually had this on my day 1 deck list when I was testing it on PTG Live. I think it's a really, really solid card. And the push of damage is actually really relevant, I feel like. Pushing that Gale Thrust to 180 doesn't sound like much, but with Tachyon Bits focusing down on these sorts of Pokemon at the same time, you can even be dealing with racing 2 prizes. I still feel like this list is pretty poor into Roaring Moon, so that's kind of why we're only seeing it pop up here and there. But it's still a really scary archetype to come up against, and I think there's some nice innovations in this list. We have another TM Evo Zard. This one's incorporating the 1/1 Toedscruel package. One thing I will say, you want to be playing the Fighting Toedscruel just in case you start this guy in a mirror match situation and your opponent has the 30 damage Charmander. Very tiny, minute thing. You're never going to try and put it down into the matchup, but in case you start it, you could randomly give up a prize card, so just a tiny thing there. But the Toedscruel is actually serving a pretty nice purpose here. We saw it in the Japanese Elite Four tournament, where this was a tech card to help out against Chien-Pao, where you're denying those superior energy retrievals and Pokestop. On PTG Live, Pokestop actually works, but it shouldn't in person. It's just a ruling that's been made. And PTG Live never quite works out like that, especially for cards like this where it has really interesting text. Outside of that, we see one boss double Countercatcher. That's a pretty interesting choice. And it's only playing one copy of Jet Energy for pivoting. I'd really like to see a Rope or a Churro come into this deck list, because you do have a couple of chunky 2-retreaters that can easily get trapped. I was mostly struggling with Gardevoir going Countercatcher on one of my chunky boys whilst hitting Iono. Even with the barrel topping me up, when you only have one out to pivot, you can find yourself getting caught short and your opponent's able to buy time with their Cress or Screamtail. Also, of course, only playing one switch out means you're pretty much dead meat to the Snorlax builds if you don't choose to tech for them. We then have another really interesting TM Evo build. This one's incorporating the Jacques supporter in addition to these Arven. Actually a pretty cool idea, especially if you can get double Bidoof developed. You go immediately into one Bibarrel, then you have the fallback of this supporter to grab your EX and your second Bibarrel, and then you have a really robust board state. It also gives you really good access to that Toedscruel tech card again. I'm surprised we haven't also seen the Toedscruel EX incorporated into the deck list, because then once you've used an Infernal Rain to power up Charizard and a Toedscruel EX, you also protect yourself against Roaring Moon, and I think that's something that needs to be explored with Charizard, because it's not necessarily a free matchup for you. And here he is, the Spicy Curry Clawf Electro deck. This is everyone's favorite rogue that everyone keeps telling me to put more time into. Clawf is officially unhinged. Its first attack does 30 and 160 more damage if it's affected by a status condition. You'll be using either your Spicy Seasoned Curry or your Brute Bonnet to get a status onto your Clawf, and then suddenly you're hitting 170 damage with the reduction of double turbo. But of course they're also poisoned if you've done a Brute Bonnet, which is 180 damage, and we have Hisuian Sneasler, which pushes that up to 200 damage. Pretty solid for a one-prize Pokemon and its fighting type, so it can punch into Iron Hands in response, which is pretty nice. And then you have the Hisuian Electrode V, which does 100 more for each status condition affecting this Pokemon. In this case, we'll try and go Brute Bonnet for the poison, Curry for the burn, and suddenly you're hitting 200 damage. Doesn't sound that impressive, but again, don't forget that we have the Sneasler Poison pushing that to 230, which is a crucial threshold, and of course, Electrode is a Grass type, and that's massive, because now suddenly you're able to knock out Charizard, and you're able to knock out Roaring Moon. So definitely a gimmicky deck, definitely a fun one. You're playing some wacky cards in combination with each other, but genuinely, this has a really good tempo play of a pretty consistent turn 1 attacking option. If you can get double turbo Capsule off or double turbo Curry, you're coming out the gate swinging quickly, and that's actually pretty disruptive in this format. So it's a really cool option, and I think it's more likely this one does remain rogue, but you can see the reason why it's seeing some play. Fusion Mew wins again, so yeah, let's start teching for it, guys. Come on, we can do this. We have a Goldengo making second. I can't believe it wasn't playing the free retreat Scyther. That's just a free gimme. That's so insane. However, once again, it is incorporating the Arven Evo package, which I do think is really solid, and it's following itself up with those Pokestops just to give yourself really decent dig in the opening stages towards your item cards to get into the game. We have a 14 energy quad path triple bravery charm Maridon here, which is kind of interesting with the Iron Hands. MP slightly refined his Lost Box Zard with a couple of those counts. We have a pretty straightforward Giratina, a Snorlax, and then we come on to another Goldengo. This one's playing the slightly thicker line of the Sizzle, and is choosing to go with the Worker Avery combination as its main support account without the TM Evo option. The draw 3s obviously have good synergy with Coin Bonus, where you're trying to amass a hand size the entire time, and there are a ton of matchups that want to really go wide, so Avery every now and then can be a pretty nice punish for those. And we end on another pretty puzzling Roaring Moon build. This one is incorporating the Darkrai VSTAR and the Quad Crushing Hammer. I didn't think I'd see hammers. I wasn't expecting this, but it can be annoying maybe for the mirror match, possibly for Maridon. Like, yeah, I don't know. This feels like it's not really worth the space, but you know what? It's an item card, it's Pokestop. You can make weird things happen, make people play a little bit differently. I don't know. At the very least, it shows Darkrai in a good light in that you can have these items coming back and giving yourself win conditions all over the place. And we finally made it to the 2 late nights. We'll start with 149. Let's have a look at the metagame. And Roaring Moon was the most popular archetype out in almost 14%, followed by Gardevoir and Chien-Pao. I'm mostly just surprised by the huge amount of variety. I think there's still people trying out all sorts right now in the formats. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see things go back up towards these 8 and 10% of some of the other more popular archetypes, but it feels like at the moment people are still willing to experiment. With that said, it was a Gardevoir that was able to take the dub. Pretty crazy list as well, a lot going on here. Who needs Worker when you can play Avery? We see 3 of them in this deck list, trying to be pretty disruptive. Obviously some card draw in there as well. Feels like the format has gone so wide, so setup based, that this just seems to be a decent card in the game right now. And don't think for a second that I didn't spot the Luxurious Cape, giving your Pokemon an additional 100 hit points. If you're trying to combine this with your Screamtail or with your Arcana Guardi, you'll notice that there's no Zacian in the deck list at all, and instead the Cape onto Arcana is your late game bomb. It's a little bit risky to go for this line of play because obviously your opponent in many situations will be targeting your Guardi line regardless, so it does put a little bit more emphasis on that. But of course, Screamtail could be doing a very similar thing where you just load up a bunch of damage onto it with the Cape on top to be a late game beat stick as well. The main upside being is that you just can't start a Zacian and then not give up an easy 2-prize knockout for a Roaring Moon player. So it's not as bad as I thought it would look on first glance. The one thing I see in just Sayat is 3 copies of VIP Pass. I don't get it. I never will. Let's move on. A DTE Mew was able to get second place. I'm really happy that I called this one. TM Devolution was a card that I was talking about in DTE Mew for the longest time and hadn't seen anyone else picking this up, so I'm glad I got that one kind of right, trying to help out against the Charizard matchup, of course. And it turns out Judge Path Disruption is still really good in the game. Grabber also helps out here and there. You can see how the triple Avery helped out in the finals, where it's going to really be a problem for a deck like this, where you completely ruin their engine. But generally, Mew still seems to have legs. We have a Rev of Room Goldengo that was able to make top 4, leaning into our favorite TM Evolution Arven package and having that rumbling engine to help you top up on cards throughout the game. This list pretty much forgoes having any single prize attacking option, and is saying that Make It Rain is just the best thing you can go for with the deck list. We have more Tina, which is more or less the same 60 always. I think this one did play double Rocks, no Iono, and it played a Pokegear, but not too big of a deal. We have Snorlax, but then we have the Zorro box. Everyone's licking their lips to see this one. And you will not be disappointed. There's a lot going on here. We've got the Scizor Cleavor combination, including a Free Retreat Scyther, which, by the way, is absolutely busted. Just having a pivot in this deck is genuinely huge. Scizor, obviously fantastic for the likes of Gardevoir, the likes of Chien-Pao, and this is generally quite high damage output right now. Cleavor being a great way to get through Iron Hands, whilst also helping out against Arceus and Maridon. Scovillain is that green guy to help out against Roaring Moon and Charizard. Setitan's just another generally high damage Mon. Mightyena coming in to help out against the Mew matchup, of course, as well as Guardi. And here it is, the control tech. Each player draws 3 cards. Not gonna do me today, Snorlax. See you later, mate. A very cool concept, and not getting mugged off by Snorlax is a really cool idea. The supporter lineup is as wacky as you would expect. It's even playing an A-spec Great Ball. You just have to enjoy the deck building process and take a bow at how they came to this conclusion. But hey, you know, people can once again enjoy playing Zoroark. We have Jirachi, so Lost Box is no longer a concern. What more can you ask for? It's finally time. Zorogang, rise up. The first late night ends with a Fusion Mew and then another water-based Roaring Moon. And let's also take a look at the metagame for the late night 150. Once again, Roaring Moon is the most popular. Kind of more so what I was thinking was going to shape up with this metagame, where we see Chen, Guardi, Charizard, Maridon all up towards the top. A decent amount of people experimenting with Lost Zone Box in here as well. Slightly different to the Lost Zone Charizard players, although I feel like this has the most legs right now. These are more like the percentages that I was going to expect. Maybe see a small uptick in Lugia in place of possibly the Goldengo, which people are exploring with right now. But I do think this is a fairly decent representation of what I expect actually going into the LAIC. It was taken down by Fusion Mew. It really does seem to be very powerful right now. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Play your tech cards. I mean, it's that simple. A Vessel Lugia got second place. I actually really like the counts of everything here. This seems like a really solid 60. The Water Energy helping you move your fish against the Snorlax block players and against Iron Hands users as well. It's playing 4 Stadium cards and Lost Vacuum. These all sound like really good counts. Yeah, just a lot of good stuff I see with this list. It seems to be right on the money with where you want to be with Lugia right now. We have a Blocklax, and then we have Celio's Gardevoir list. Seeing some interesting stuff here, we have the Zinnia's Resolve incorporated to a handful of different supporters and the Palpad in the list. And once again, we have the Luxurious Cape. I feel like if you're playing this card, you at least cut the Zacian. You don't really need both, I don't think. Especially when you're choosing to play 3 copies of Arcana Guardia as well. So a couple counts that I think are a little bit wonky here, but it's not crazy different from what we've seen previously. For what it's worth, I do like the Churro Palpad package. I think it's respecting Lax, and in general just seems like a good combination to have right now, as another way to try and represent purely one prize board states. We have Jared Grimes's Pow Hands list, definitely one to take note of because they've been doing pretty well in regional tournaments as of late. It's incorporating the Drapion V, so a decent amount of respect being given to Mew, which I think is reasonable for the online space right now. It's playing just the one countercatcher again and going away from the cross switchers, squeezing in the Poké Gear, getting to play the extra Ball Search card, obviously making the space for the Drapion. It makes sense why it's gone down this approach. I mentioned earlier that I like the flip-flop of Vessel lightning counts, but when you're playing the Drapion anyway for burst potential into the Mew, it's less important. So just having less percentage of prizing makes more sense in this build. We have another really interesting Guardi list, again playing the 3 copies of the Arcana, and the Luxurious Cape is once again making it in. Seems like Zacian's out and the Cape is in. That just seems to be the play right now. Something I wasn't necessarily expecting, but I do really feel like it makes sense, honestly. It makes Screamtail much more dangerous, and it gives you a late game swing with that Brainwave as well. It's a panic alternative to finding reversal energy as well, so that's always okay. I'm constantly scratching my head at how these react to Iron Hands, and I don't know how they really deal with the turn 2 hands, to be honest with you. But over and over again, these are the Guardi lists that I'm seeing, so I kind of just have to put it down to Guardi being busted. We have another Snorlax stall, and we end on Lost Box. And it's like an old Lost Box. There's nothing new here at all, to be honest with you. Just classic, let me get to 7, let me gate, let me swing. It's got the tracking shoes in here, the very high Pokestop counts. It's Old Faithful, and apparently it's still working, which was pretty interesting to see with so much hot debate and so few people playing Turbo anymore and going to different ways to play Lost Box. It's amazing to see that this one still kind of just chilled and carried on and did pretty good. I'm aware that this video is already dragging on. I was getting real deep into the weeds there with all the deck lists, but I did just want to end on the Trainer Hill data. A few things that really stuck out to me. Fusion Mew's data is looking incredible right now. Its Roaring Moon matchup is actually just a 50-50, so that's cool to see. It really feels like Charizard is the only check to it. So honestly, we need to start teching for this deck, otherwise it's going to be a real problem at the LAIC. Gardevoir percentages is looking actually pretty good. I'm surprised at how decent the Chien-Pao Caliber matchup is for how few are actually playing TM Evo, which might mean that the turn 2 Iron Hands isn't as big of a concern as I was expecting. You are, however, losing ground into Maridon. This used to be a pretty positive matchup, so that's a new concern for the deck. And if you actually care about beating Snorlax, you probably need to play Churro Palpad, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. Speaking of which, Snorlax's data is disgustingly good. Another deck that we have to start caring about. It feels like everyone's going for streamlined, straightforward deck lists, but ultimately, if I was going to the LAIC, I'd be packing my Churros, I'd be packing my Drapion/Spiritombs, whichever you think is correct for your deck list, because I think these have great numbers behind them and have had a decent amount of results in this first week. And then finally, just to touch on Roaring Moon, because it has been by far the most popular deck in almost all of these tournaments. Its main problem matchup seems to be Gardevoir, which isn't too surprising because they're trying to always represent single prize board states whenever they can. The Lost Box Charizard, which is very similar. Other Lost Zone variants where once again they can do that, and they have multi-prize Pokemon, but most notably they are playing heavy vacuum count, so they can pull back the Roaring Moon to low hit points once again. And somehow it seems that no one knows how to play against Snorlax stall. Feels like it just has enough options to trap pretty much any deck in the game right now. So that was a lot of talking. Hopefully it was interesting to you guys. I'm going to be coming out with my top 10 decks in the format very soon, so hopefully that can give you even more insight. I've been diving deep into the data for both Japan and these online tournaments, so I'm also going to be throwing some more data at you before the LAIC, trying to be as helpful as possible before we start getting into this format. Let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think of the data and the deck lists that were presented today? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.